the Freedom of Information Act really is just our basic democracy tool. It's just one of those tools that you just everybody has in the shed. You've got a shovel, you've got a hammer, you got a screwdriver under the sink, whatever. It's one of those tools of democracy that we need.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. A quick reminder, we'll be having our first 30-minute skills session at noon on January 22nd. Data Cleaning 101. The instructor will be Boston University professor and investigative journalist Maggie Mulvihill. Maggie's going to begin to teach us how to take messy data sets and then turn that into information that we can then use toward our reporting. It's going to be a very helpful session. Again, only 30 minutes long. Hopefully you can fit it into your lunch break on that day, noon, January 22nd. It's free, courtesy NEFAC, open to all, but you do have to register at nefac.org, and you can do that now. I encourage you all to join us. I'm here today with Austin Kocher, who's the research assistant professor at Syracuse University. He's also part of the team that publishes the FOIA Project blog. Austin, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Austin, I wanted to have you on today to discuss this recent report by the FOIA Project that goes back 20 years and looks at all of the litigation regarding the Federal Freedom of Information Act commenced by media organizations and individual journalists. But before we get to that report and your takeaways, if you could first tell us a little bit about the FOIA Project, the type of work that you do, and for those that aren't familiar with the federal statute, if you could explain to us briefly what is FOIA and what's it intended to do.
Sure. So the principle behind the Freedom of Information Act is that citizens in any country should be able to find out what the government has, the records that they have on file. The very first laws around that were passed a couple hundred years ago, actually, in Sweden, where any citizen could just walk into a government office and look at whatever they wanted. In the United States, we passed the first version of that law back in the 60s. And then strengthened it again in the 70s after the Watergate scandal. And the whole driving principle there was that the government had important records, important data that the public should be aware of. And the Freedom of Information Act allows anyone, any of us, can write a FOIA request and send it to the government. And that is one of the most important ways that we learn about what's going on inside of the government, and a very important way that the news media and journalists tell stories that are timely and relevant to the public. So we here at the FOIA Project, we've been involved in that work from the very beginning. The founders of the FOIA Project were part of writing that legislation decades ago, and so we're involved in tracking just really what's going on with the number of FOIA requests, what agencies they're going to, and then of course, as we're talking about today, we're really interested in the kinds of litigation that individuals and news organizations follow through on, because it's so important that when the government, in some cases, does not follow the FOIA law, does not release records that they ought to, that there's a mechanism for doing that, and we want to highlight that and understand what's going on.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because the FOIA Project just released a report, 20 years of FOIA litigation by news organizations and reporters. A ton of data and research went into this report. Tell us a little bit more about what the findings were and some of your key takeaways.
Sure. So, like we said, we look back over 20 plus years of data, 20 years of data for this report. And, we looked at every single Freedom of Information Act lawsuit filed in federal courts, almost 700 of them over 20 years, just by the media. And a couple of things that we really walked away with was, actually, kind of surprisingly, it's only been relatively recently that the news media have really been proactive and a real force for pursuing litigation around FOIA. Back when the Freedom of Information Act was enacted, the news media was a major proponent, a major reason why that law passed in the first place, but actually didn't really jump on board FOIA litigation for quite some time. We've really seen that change. And so the second big takeaway really is that there's just been a lot more litigation in the past 10 years. Really since 2013, we started to see more cases. But even since 2013, just in the last 4 years during the Trump administration, there have been more FOIA cases then than under the 16 years of the Obama and the second Bush, Bush 2, the 8 years of the Bush administration. So we've really just seen a lot of cases. And, and sort of the third takeaway point is that a lot of this is driven by really motivated entrepreneurial journalists who are really trying to do some cutting edge work and open up, parts of the government to the public that haven't really been that public before. And it's not really just the numbers. It's not just the 700 cases. It's you think of the important stories that the American public would not know about, from understanding the family separation policy and the immigration world to to other parts of other important stories that we wouldn't know about if it weren't for these journalists doing this important work. So it's the numbers, it's the growth, but it's also just the value, the qualitative value that comes out of this work.
So maybe you can help us understand some of the reasons behind this data. So, for example, you mentioned this real uptick in litigation, especially during the last two administrations, but over the last several years, particularly. Mm-hmm. Is this because current administrations haven't been, I guess, as FOIA friendly as others? Is it because media organizations have been more aggressive about seeking information that they need to report? What has caused this uptick in litigation?
Yeah, I think that more research really needs to be done to understand all of the driving factors and the changes that we're seeing. There's really a lot more that we'd like to do with it, but I think there's probably two main driving factors. One is sort of contextual. We've seen a lot of FOIA litigation under the Trump administration, under the Obama administration too, but there's a sense based on the cases that we've looked at that when the government, starts to close up and shut down, and there's more controversy around whether or not the public can really trust what federal agencies are really saying, then that does create a demand that creates pressure on the news industry to get the information that they need and to put more resources into going to court. And so, so there are some delays in the FOIA system for sure, major delays in the FOIA request process. There's also just stonewalling at various agencies. We've had a really hard time getting the Department of Homeland Security to comply with FOIA requests and FOIA policy. So there's lots of reasons why an increase might actually be a kind of an indicator or a bellwether for where federal agencies are at, really, and the degree to which some of them have been politicized more in recent years, not just the Trump administration, but before. And the other one, I think, the second driver, I think, has to do with the tacit knowledge and expertise within the field. We see a lot more journalists are getting exposed earlier on in their careers to Freedom of Information Act as a tool for journalism. We get interns through the Newhouse School of Journalism at Syracuse University, one of the best schools in the country for journalism. And we get students who come through and who are learning about how to do FOIA requests in their second, third, fourth year of their undergraduate education. So I think a lot of it is also awareness and a sense of community, that there really are some people out there kind of leading the way, and even more journalists than ever saying, oh, if I want to find a place in the world for myself as a journalist, if I want to cut out a little part in this, really, it's a very challenging field working in journalism right now, as we all know. Newspapers and all of this are really facing challenges. Then I think it creates some pressure internally on journalists to be more innovative and more creative, and FOIA is one way for people to make a name for themselves.
Yeah, and I think maybe that partly answers my next question, because one of my takeaways from reading the report is that there's been an increase, not just in overall number of cases throughout the years, but there's also been a significant increase in the number of suits filed by individual reporters as opposed to on behalf of media organizations, which I found interesting because litigation's an expensive pursuit. It costs money. Not everyone can reach into their pocket and pay an attorney to represent them and to file a FOIA suit. Why do you think there have been more suits filed by individual reporters as opposed to the organizations that they work for themselves going after this information?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd like to know more, frankly, about some of the internal conversations at some of our major news outlets. I mean, one of the things that I noticed in trying to address this question when I was writing the report and doing the analysis is, um, one of the issues here is that there's kind of a ceiling on how many national news organizations are going to spend the resources. As you say, it's an expensive process. You've got to hire an attorney. Most of these lawsuits take years. I mean, the lawsuits that we filed, often take several years to conclude. And so how many news organizations in the country have the resources and the investment? Well, if you tick them off in your head, Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, a couple others, maybe the LA Times. How many news organizations, though, once you check off the top 10 or 15, how many are left with the resources and expertise to do that? Below the national level, probably not that many. So I think that there's probably sort of a natural ceiling to even how many news organizations in the country are able to do it. Whereas, there's less of a ceiling for individual reporters. Lots and lots of reporters, there's just more of a pool of people that could come in as individual reporters and start filing lawsuits. And maybe it's just more flexible. Maybe for the journalists themselves, they have more freedom to file it themselves as a journalist than going, through and getting approval from their, parent organization. That's just sort of, intuition and conversations that we've had with journalists about this data, but I'd certainly love to know more. And gosh, I mean, if you have insight, I'd be welcome to hear it too.
Yeah, well, I think all of that can certainly be the case. And I think it goes back to what you were saying before. Many journalists, particularly young journalists, I think, are being introduced to, if not to FOIA, but to local, state public record laws much earlier in their careers. And I think they're also more willing to use those laws as part of the reporting. For example, every year we at NEFAC, we host an investigative journalism training program. We get a number of journalists throughout the region that are earlier in their careers, and they come in and they're looking for any tool they can possibly use to get information to enhance their stories. So they're very eager to learn about these public record laws and any kind of federal statute that's going to open up the story for them and let them describe what's going on in better, more effective ways. So I think that's really a part of it too. But lastly, Austin, before we wrap up here, because we
Sure.
have a lot of people that are, interested in the First Amendment and open government that aren't journalists, that don't work in newsrooms and aren't attorneys representing those journalists, right? So if you could you kind of break all this down for us in simple terms and apply this
Mhm.
to your average citizen? Why should he or she care about all of these FOIA cases being pursued every year? How does this ultimately affect them?
Well, I think the most important thing for people to come away with is it really matters the quality of information we have. We're sitting here after a very contentious election and some very contentious political activity in the country that is at the front of the news, and part of that conversation are questions and debates around misinformation and just how does someone know that they're getting good information? How do any of us know that when the government releases something or makes a statement that what they're saying is accurate and reliable? How do we get the information that we need so we can just have a rational democratic conversation in this country about any of the things that matter to all of us? To be able to answer any of those questions means being able to have some insight into the information that the government itself has to make decisions, and to just verify the things that they're releasing. And so the Freedom of Information Act really is just our basic democracy tool. It's just one of those tools that you just everybody has in the shed. You've got a shovel, you've got a hammer, you got a screwdriver under the sink, whatever. It's one of those tools of democracy that we need. And we need to be able to use whenever the time arises. So it's really that fundamental. And the journalists that are out there using it, not everybody listening needs to, not everybody in America needs to jump into filing for FOIA requests. But when you know that journalists are relying on that to verify and to fact check their stories and to verify and fact check our government as a basic function of journalism in America and the First Amendment, then that those stories and those journalists are doing work that you can trust and that you can value. And it's not always like the government's just not telling the truth. That's not the motivation here. Lots of times they are. It's just, either way, you want to be able to check their work, right? And so that just adds to trust. I think it's really important that we get back to a kind of approach to public conversation and discourse built around trust and a common set of facts. And FOIA helps us do that.
Well said. Well, thank you so much, and appreciate all the work that you do at Syracuse as well as at the FOIA project. Please keep it up.
Thank you. You too.